and thanks for all the organisers for inviting me. And thanks for you to come in on this sunny Saturday morning. I don't think it's fair. UK University with so many people on Saturday. It's not just here, but it seems really busy anyway. But okay, right. So just picking up from what Eva said in the introduction, really, I think an alternative title for this presentation will be Accelerationism versus Postmodernism, I think, and that is in a way the driving dynamic of a lot of my work. Really, that even though the term postmodernism isn't really used that much anymore, I think it's ceased to be used not because it's irrelevant, but because it's become naturalised. That the situation, the conditions as described by Frederick Jameson, it's Jameson's version of postmodernism. I would say is the one that I'm most interested in. The conditions that.
Sorry, I just.
Okay. I always have problems with mics.
Sorry, that should be better.
Okay. The conditions that Jameson described starting in the 80s have only intensified since then, really. And a lot of my work has been about that. It's been about the struggle between the possibilities of a libidinal popular culture which could feed into politics, the possibilities of, as you briefly mentioned in the introduction, of what I call a popular modernism, and how those possibilities have been stymied, thwarted, and blocked by the emergence of a kind of what I call a naturalised postmodernism now. Okay, well, just then a brief sketch of, I would say, the three phases of accelerationism proper. Of course, as established in the accelerationism reader, there's a long history of accelerationist thought, I think. Going back to the 19th century. But in terms of the kind of specific discourses, I think that there's really three moments we can identify. The first would be, that associated with Deleuze and Guattari, Lyotard, libidinal economy, especially, and also, perhaps more importantly, the autonomia movement in Italy of the 70s. What I've started to call acid communism, I think, in lots of ways. The fusion of a psychedelic, kind of post-psychedelic currents coming out of the 60s with libidinal politics, the embrace of a certain version of technology, and the rejection of work and drudgery as fundamental, and also an anti-authoritarian dimension to this politics being fundamental. In lots of ways, I think that's the Italian experiment's more significant than May '68. Partly because they stepped out of, partly because they were so sustained, and I think they had a broader-based potential actually. But yeah, so I think that the first phase we can see it as rooted in the 70s, with anti-Oedipus and what followed from that. And I think the experiments in Italy were, where the ideas in anti-Oedipus were tried out and adapted, and experimented with, and what happened there, feeding back into Thousand Plateaus in 1980. So I think with that moment, perhaps there are a couple of things to say about that are key. One of which is the focus on the libidinal, and the idea that the aesthetic and libidinal are crucial to politics, and that they can't be ceded, they can't be left to capitalism. There's a struggle over desire, and the machineries of desire must be central to sort of any revolutionary project. Secondly, the idea that the struggle against capitalism can't only be construed in negative terms. In lots of ways, I mean, I think this is one of the key claims and importance of so-called accelerationism is this flip. It isn't that isn't so much about anti-capitalism then, so much as you could say that capitalism is intrinsically about blocking certain tendencies, about blocking and thwarting those tendencies, about maintaining a sort of distance between the potentials that emerge from a certain material resource base on which capitalism depends. Maintaining a distance between those potentials and what can actually be allowed to happen in the social space. So, one of the big fallacies, endlessly rejected, argued against, but still persistent about accelerationism is the idea that it's about making things worse to make them better, that it's about intensifying capitalism. No, I think the key thing is that it's about accelerating certain tendencies which capitalism itself has to keep at bay, and that when those tendencies are accelerated, that we go beyond the standard forms of subjectivity, life and work which capitalism depends upon. So I think that's the points to one of the key gambits, I think, of accelerationism in this first phase. The second phase would be around the 90s. That's where I sort of came on board. Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, Nick Land, Sadie Plants, associated also with cyberfeminism. I think this has been characterised as the neoliberal turn or neo-right accelerationism. But I don't think that fully captures what's at stake in this moment. Actually, that it's not just about neoliberalism. Actually, in Nick Land's work, which I don't want to talk an awful lot about today, but just in passing, it's more a kind of cosmic libertarianism, I think, in Land's work, rather than about being about individuals, which is the ostensible gambit of neoliberalism. And it's some inhuman force which is liberated through capitalism, not really human beings as such. I don't think this is a story that neoliberalism would want to tell, actually, and that Nick Land is at best a sort of ambivalent ally of neoliberals, you could say. But perhaps what's key about that moment also was the resonance of a lot of the rhetoric, language, and tone of theory of Nick Land and Sadie Plant with certain forms of popular culture in the 1990s. Particularly in the UK, that post-rave, rave and post-rave moment, mutational, psychedelic, collective psychedelic cultures, where they're still possible then, and at that point, to make claims about the extent to which a popular culture in a society still governed by capitalism, even if you don't want to say that culture was capitalist as such, could be accelerationist. I think that we've passed that moment now. There really isn't the equivalent of rave, post-rave in the 21st century. That's why that quotation that Eva gave at the top about the 21st century hasn't really happened in popular culture in lots of ways. The line I always put forward that there's really nothing in terms of, if we treat music culture as an example, as a case study, there's really nothing in 21st century music culture that couldn't have happened in the 20th. in the 20th century. And you can, people can dispute this and often do, but I've never come up with a killer example yet to block this for me. And, the simple thought experiment you can do is just imagine anything you've heard in the 21st century beam back to, like, say, 1996, 20 years ago now. What would someone listening to that think if they heard it? Would they think, my God, I can't believe that this music, it sounds so different from anything I've heard now? No one would think that about anything that you've heard in the 21st century. And I think that points to this cultural deceleration or flatlining of time that has occurred in the period since the 90s to now, and why that Landian accelerationist moment just wouldn't have the cultural resources to draw upon, or the cultural resonances that it did have in the 90s, actually, in the 21st century. And a lot of what I'm going to say today then is really about the implications of, or rather the cause of that. Why have things frozen? Why has culture in many ways stayed the same? Why, in other words, are we in this condition of exacerbated or naturalised postmodernism in the Jamesonian sense, where there is no novelty, or no substantial novelty, no real breaks from the past, and where we're locked into a kind of perpetual moment of repetition or pastiche. And that's the issues arising, I think, from the second moment of accelerationism. The third is the one that emerged more recently, coalescing from, I guess, the late part of the last decade and on into this decade. Some of that coming together in the symposium we had at Goldsmiths, 5-6 years ago, that Nick spoke at, that Alex Williams spoke at, Benjamin Noy spoke at, and which, part of which has developed into the direction that Nick and Alex's work has taken into a kind of rediscovered left accelerationism. Okay, but so I think the broader perspective I'd like to sort of bring here can be indicated by this quote from Marcuse, I think is quite interesting to look at from the perspective of accelerationism. I guess my claim is to be that, contrary to some of the kind of miserableist denunciations of accelerationism, I refuse to see the key claims of accelerationism as in any way heretical in terms of the general currents of Marxism or communism. I don't think this is heretical. I think it's in a way part of the mainstream of thought. And I think that some of the key claims are put here by Marcuse. The close to real possibility of liberating the individual from the constraints once justified by scarcity and immaturity, the greater the need for maintaining and streamlining these constraints, lest the established order of domination dissolve. Civilization has to protect itself against the spectre of a world which could be free. In exchange for the commodities that enrich their lives, individuals sell not only their labour but also their free time. This is in the 50s. Marcuse was writing this, 54, Eros and Civilization. Now out of print, quite interesting, actually. Marcuse's own fate as a figure is quite telling, actually. Let's not go into that in a minute. And have private automobiles with which they can no longer escape into a different world. They have huge refrigerators stuffed with frozen foods. They have dozens of newspapers and magazines which espouse the same ideas. They have innumerable choices, innumerable gadgets which are all of the same sort, and keep them occupied and divert their attention from the real issue, which is the awareness that they could both work less and determine their own needs and satisfactions. So I think that this highlights for me the key strategies of capital since in a post-war period, and in various ways, which has in a sense always been the same. That if the technological basis for a society which could be free is there, technological and material basis is there, then this has to be continually thwarted. And the effort of capital there must be to block this and to, as Marcuse puts it, distract people from this awareness of the possibility of freedom from drudgery and freedom from work. And I think what Marcuse is pointing to here, I think that one of the benefits of Marcuse's thought is the way in which he quite clearly has that kind of Frankfurt School critical perspective on contemporary capitalism, but he also has a sense of what capitalism is blocking, what capitalism is obstructing. And the most powerful passages in Marcuse's work are those in which he vividly evokes a world free of drudgery, and the concept of drudgery being central to Marcuse's thought. But I think that the emphasis on the administration of free time is perhaps especially relevant in the current moment in terms of the capitalist use of technology now. Why the takeoff of capitalist cyberspace, which at least from this dystopian perspective, we can see as opening up unprecedented levels of access for capital to people's consciousness and time in a way that could not have been dreamt of when Marcuse was writing this in the 50s, when capital had control over people's working lives, but a limited capacity to intervene in consciousness beyond that. Limited, you might say not that limited by comparison with the previous periods then, but certainly limited by comparison with now. In that, something like a smartphone then opens us up 24/7 to the compulsions of capital. It opens up consciousness to almost complete irradiation of capital at all times of the day. Another version then of the one-dimensional world which Marcuse most famously spoke about. But I think the importance here is to see capital as thwarting, is to see capital as capital's use of technology as thwarting the potentials of the material and technological potentials that are available, and this being fundamental to its strategy. As a case study of where we are now. Anyone recognise this? Everett, you talked about the importance of literature, etc., and I think that this novel is, for me, one of the most powerful novels of recent period for capturing the existential conditions of capitalist cyberspace and its effects. Paul, maybe 20 minutes after we'd begun refreshing Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, Gmail, and a continuous cycle, with an ongoing, affectless, humanless realisation that his day was over, noticed with confusion, having thought it was AM, that it was 4:46 PM. Anyone recognise this? Anyone recognise? You might recognise the syndrome. Anyone recognise the novel? No? Okay. Then he was sitting on a mattress in a space module-like bedroom in which 6 to 10 people smoking marijuana watched a video off a MacBook of obese people screaming in pain earnestly while exercising and being screamed at motivationally in what seemed to be a grotesque parody or something of something. Paul felt strong aversion to the video, and also like he'd already experienced this exact situation. He remembered his aversion to the video and the way someone to his right was laughing. And he wanted to ask if this already happened, but didn't know who to ask. Then realised he wanted to ask himself. Another one. In the movie of his life, he knew now would be the moment, like when a character quotes Coleridge in The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, as the screen shows blurry, colourful, festive images of people outside at night, to feel that the world was beautiful and sad, which he felt self-consciously and briefly, exerting effort to focus instead on the conversation, which was producing its own unmediated emotions. When he spoke, people became attentive to him, but passively, at their leisure, with neutral expressions, as if watching an infomercial. Neither annoyed nor entertained, feeling no obligation to respond or engage. I could read these all down. In his state of near immunity from shame and or anxiety, acknowledged a theoretical embarrassment which someone not an MDMA in this situation might experience. I think this is the last one. Sorry. He couldn't ignore a feeling that he wasn't alone, but in the brain of the universe, where everything that happened was concurrently recorded as public and indestructible data, he was already partially with everyone else that had died. The information of his existence, the etching of which into space-time was the experience of life, was being studied by millions of entities billions of years from now, who knew him better than he would ever know himself. They knew everything about him, even his current thoughts, in their exact vagueness. As he moved distractedly towards sleep, studying him in the equivalent of middle school, maybe thought some fleeting aspect of Paul's consciousness, unaware what it was referencing. Okay, yeah. So these are all quotations from Tao Lin's novel Taipei, which, as I indicate, I think then is a great study of a certain moment of the capture of consciousness and human existential being via capitalist cyberspace. What I've called the naturalization of postmodernism could equally well be experienced as the artificialization of everything. That as Paul as we see, there's a certain experience of time that Paul has. This distance from himself, where, as it were, two sides of the postmodern come together, you could say, or that on the one hand, the idea of a kind of meta-referentialism, where you're never. Things are never themselves always at one level above and reflecting on in a kind of bad infinite regress. On the other hand, there's this kind of free-floating Deleuzean affect. If this was Jonathan Franzen novel, it'd be pretty clear that Paul is depressed. But there's no subject Paul that can experience this depression. There's no mediating ego between the affects and the meta self-consciousness. So there is a kind of endlessly self-referential self-consciousness and free-floating emotions, and they just don't come together at all. Just this kind of bleak, glassy sense of fatalism. And of the sense that everything has already happened before, even as it's already happened, and the use of drugs, which we've seen some indications of that in those quotations, reinforcing this kind of bad imminence, you could say, this failure to be able to escape from anything, and the sense that everything is already pre-written. Of course, one of the great thinkers who anticipates this is Baudrillard. I think his work is pretty astonishing and really worth looking at again very seriously in terms of in the context of the current moment. I mean, Baudrillard in the 70s was already writing of a great festival of participation made up of myriad stimuli, miniaturized tests, and infinitely divisible modes of question-answers that brings with it whole imaginary based on contact. In this culture of tactile communication, we pass from the ultimation to solicitation, from obligatory passivity to modes constructed from the outset on the basis of the subject's active response, and this subject's involvement and ludic participation towards a total environment made up of incessant spontaneous responses, joyous feedback and irradiated contacts. When I read Baudrillard, it's kind of, you think, what the hell was he talking about? You know, the French Minitel system of the 70s, you know, the phones barely worked as far as I understand it. It's really that almost only makes sense if we see him as having time travelled to the era of smartphones and social media and writing about that. And, you know, particularly if you look at his essay, The Ecstasy of Communication, which seems really to be about Twitter in many ways, even though it was written 20 years before the advent of Twitter. I think, you know, Baudrillard's the great successor then of Marcuse in this way of understanding the way in which capital, though it's not a term that he would have used by that point, had incorporated the kind of demands for democratic involvement or democratic control of life, culture and politics, you know, into this model of participation and contact with which we're now all familiar. And which one of the endpoints is the digital purgatory of Tao Lin. Ms. Tao Lin's quite interesting because it's really before smartphones, so that it's already like a Jane Austen world, I think, for slightly genteel by comparison with the level of immersion which smartphones now command and demand. Now, we talked also about Franco Berardi, Bifo, in the introduction, and one of the things that I'd like to draw out today is really that I think a lot of Franco's critiques of accelerationism are really not in a way critiques of accelerationism, but are based on a kind of conflation of the concept of accelerationism as, you know, developed recently with a kind of what I call phenomenological acceleration, which I'm not even sure if that's the right term. I think this is one of the things that has dogged discussion around accelerationism is these confusion of the two things, of the kind of info blitz which I think Franco writes very well about, and which we're all now familiar with. The conflation of that with a sense of cultural acceleration. The acceleration of information exchange is produced the effect of a pathological type on the individual human mind and even more on the collective mind. Individuals are not in a position to process the immense and always growing mass of information that enters their computers, their cell phones, their television screens, their electronic diaries and their heads. However, it seems indispensable to follow, recognise, evaluate, process all this information if you want to be efficient, competitive and victorious. Necessary time for paying attention to fluxes of information is lacking. No, I think I at least fully endorse this. But I guess what I'm saying is that, it's because of this inundation of the individual consciousness that acceleration at another level doesn't happen. That this info blitz, semio blitz, the inundating of the collective mind with an unmanageable amount of data freezes and blocks the capacity for kind of mutation and transformation, I would argue. So it's no accident that as this has grown, you could say that the conditions that I described earlier, the conditions where popular culture is on rewind or on a flat line or nothing new is really happening. It's no accident that this has happened at the same time as these conditions of info blitz. So, I guess what I'm saying is that rather than this being as opposed to the accelerationist project, it illustrates the ways in which capitalism, or particularly capitalist cyberspace, in its current form, inhibits the capacity for acceleration. I think one of the key issues here, and the key opposition here, is not really slowness versus speed, but actually consistency versus fragmentation, you could say. that what is blocked in contemporary conditions of capitalist cyberspace most strongly is an experience or sense of, or not really sense of, but actual production of consistency, you could say. Which I think is an important concept from Deleuze and Guattari. And that's another way of getting to acceleration versus the post and the postmodern, I think. And a postmodern is characterised by a kind of incommensurability, a fragmentation, an experience of fragmentation or bittiness, which is now, in a way, a standard experience. Certainly, if we're for experiences mediated through smartphones, where our attention is pulled in multiple directions at any one time. And clearly, this is the opposite of a kind of production of a consistency. And we can see this operating on lots of levels. The point at which the minds previously would idle. Often when minds are idle, when they weren't locked into a certain kind of stimuli, that newness or novelty would appear. It's that very possibility of idling is now blocked, because the moments when our brains would idle, when we're queuing, waiting for a bus, or such like, are exactly the moments that are quickly filled in by capitalist cyberspace. And if you think about it on a multiple level, that on a mass level, not just the level of individual mind, I think we get a sense of the extent to which there's a kind of seizure in a double sense there, a kind of seizing of attention, and also a kind of a fit or a kind of impasse or just blockage. I think that the result of that is what I would call the pseudo-past. I mean, Paulo Vieira, in his book Deja Vu and the End of History, which is recently translated by Verso, but I think a book produced a number of years ago, he talks about a state of mind that says that state of mind correlated to deja vu is that typical of those set on watching themselves live. This means apathy, fatalism, and indifference to a future that seems prescribed even down to the last detail. So so he calls this the pseudo-past. I mean, this is what deja vu is like. It's not a past, it's the present, but it seems as if it is the past. I think we can reverse this and we talk about a pseudo-present, where we, in conditions of generalised or naturalised postmodernity, where we're living through things which we've already lived through, where culture is just repeating itself, this is experienced as if it was new when it is in fact already familiar. As the crassest but also most telling example, look at the recent Star Wars film. It's just astonishing, absolutely astonishing. How you could have almost it's like a postmodern project. How can you have almost exactly the same film as the first one, which was already a pastiche? And Jameson used the original 77 Star Wars as an example of a postmodern pastiche. So how can you produce this pastiche of the original film while still presenting it as a new film with added diversity for the 21st century? So I think a lot of what I'm sort of pointing towards here then is a politics of time and the struggle over time and the way in which time is used, both the level of culture and politics in a broad sense, but also in the level of sort of everyday phenomenology. Jody Dean's very good in this at lots of levels. This from Communicative Capitalism and Class Struggle points to this temporal dispossession in a powerful way. The dispossession of big data is not about control of our individual identities. Rather, we are dispossessed of a certain kind of temporality and a certain kind of being together. These are expropriated from us and put to alien use. Two kinds of temporality are expropriated, the momentary and the futural. We lose the momentary because everything leaves a storable trace. moving through space with a mobile phone creates data. Touching a screen, looking at a screen creates data. Rather than a time of instance, we have a time of permanence. In this time, mistakes, errors, and lies coexist with corrections. We lose a dimension of futurity in that a primary mode of data analysis is predictive. The search for patterns is in order to predict and intervene in the future, even if that future is only microseconds ahead, as happens in high-frequency trading. In each case, data analytics try to eliminate surprise, the very possibility that something could happen, inseparable from futurity. And I think this captures, one important dimension of the present, which is, on the one hand, the compulsive and the impulsive, on the other hand, the eternal. I mean, you couldn't, in lots of ways, hope for a better capture system than that. Something which, on the one hand, erodes people's capacity for self-control. And this is what most apps are for, right? And certainly the ones being pushed by corporations. And on the other hand, which keeps a permanent record of everything you've done. So I'm just going to come towards at the end then is to highlight this question of time and the cultural politics of time as crucial. And to, partly what comes out of this previous thing, I think, is this question, is one of the seeming paradoxes of neoliberalism, which is a time of uncertainty without unpredictability, you could say. And this is the time of late capitalist precarity, and I guess part of what I'm pointing towards here is that the precarity does not produce unpredictability in culture. This is one of the claims of the sort of neo-Victorian claims of neoliberalism is that if you remove security from people, they will become more creative. I think there's a 30-year experiment which has definitively proved the opposite of that. So, time is the fundamental means of production. You can have as much equipment as you like, but if you don't have time to use it, then there's nothing you can do with it. And you have to sort of recognise that as central. And that includes, quality as well as quantity of time. And both of those are attacked in the current conditions, right? The overwork, overwork or the expansion of work beyond the working day, as it was understood in Fordism. The blurring between work and forms of enjoyment, all of this which we're all familiar with, which we all live, all of which I think then has consequences for our attentional resources, which are constantly under attack, constantly being eroded, and constantly stopping the production of the new. Oh, sorry. I don't know why I've pluralised that. The washing machine is a better model for progressive technology than the smartphone. Okay, this is... So I think... Why am I saying that? Well, it's because, I think... I've got rid of my smartphone, so I'm kind of... it's like a Damascene conversion, like a religious convert about it. But that's the... Okay, just as a quick way to get into it, I think most people have their internet's capacity to access the internet blocked for a few days. There'd at least be some positive dimension to that. You at least think, God, at least I don't have to answer emails, check stuff, whatever. But at least you can get access to a different kind of time, which even if you're a completely compulsive social media addict, you at least see some benefit of that. Because if your washing machine breaks down, there's no upside. There's no upside. You just, something which had been taken out of drudgery, which had minimised drudgery, suddenly then appears again as drudgery. You know, I think there's a little parable about the technologies that are progressively powerful are those which you do not notice. You do not notice that you're not fixated on, that allow you to do other things than be obsessed with them. And that, you know, that's the exact opposite of the smartphone, I think, which locks us into this kind of relationship with it, which never lets us forget it, which never lets us achieve that time of consistency that I was talking about before. Someone at Goldsmiths was pointing out when, as it was inevitable, that information technology failed at yet another public lecture. That the reason we call it information technology is because it doesn't work. You know, we don't talk about plumbing technology anymore because we generally are used to the fact that works in the background and we don't have to think about it. Anyway, so I think we've got the point of that one. So I think it's worth reminding ourselves also that freedom is a freedom from compulsion, and that one of the main ways in which smartphones are utilised by capitalism is, as I said, engines of compulsion, and with practically unlimited reach. You know, wherever there's this phone signal, then you know that this compulsion can be generated. And I think then it's not that we can't imagine these communicative technologies deployed in a different way, but I think there's some kind of assumption that we'll naturally be able to find the right dosage or relationship to them. I think this is a kind of myth propagated by capitalism. That one of my students was saying that he can anticipate a point where handheld devices will be considered like smoking. And that, you know, he'll say, or like, you know, drinking wine or something, like, yeah, I did a bit of checking with dinner or after dinner or whatever. You can imagine that time. But at the moment, you know, that these technologies have been allowed to destroy a lot of existing forms of cultural habit, habituation, etiquette, etc. Not that those forms of habit and etiquette should be ratified, without any form of collective etiquette or habituation really being developed around them. And I think, you know, this facilitating this capture of our attention and our libidinal energies by capitalism. So, I mean, I think where it's ending up then is the question about the politics of time, which I think has two dimensions. One, we can talk about the level of everyday life and phenomenology, which would be, you know, access to a time free from compulsion and drudgery. And, you know, one of the ways which we can define capitalism, I'd say, is as a system which generates real scarcity in order to produce artificial scarcity, and the reverse, which generates artificial scarcity in order to generate real scarcity. And by artificial scarcity, I mean fundamentally a scarcity of time. This taking us back to the quotation from Marcuse at the beginning, that the possibilities of a world free of drudgery, the possibilities of the spectre of a world that could be free is there, but capitalism functions, particularly in its current form, in order to continually block the actualization of that spectre. So, compulsion, in the broader sense of being forced to do things, as well as the kind of sense in which I've emphasised today, which is the emphasis on a kind of pleasure addiction as mediated by smartphones. But then so that's, I think, the level more of what we could call phenomenology or experience. But then at the level of cultural and political time, I think, you know, one of the markers of the postmodern, according to Lyotard famously, is the disappearance of grand narratives. Or in another register, Jameson has talked about the disappearance of providence. I think that's quite interesting, actually, that since 1989 we could say the concept of providence has disappeared from the world. But Jameson talks about a material providence, as the communist project offering a material providence that would that promised to overcome the religious sense of providence, right? And instead that the religious sense of providence, that the sense of that history was pre-programmed by God, would be overcome by a material providence as human agency assumed control of history. And I think that the leftist project must in fact recover this Promethean ambition to have for material providence, for a shape or design to history, which isn't the same as a kind of, by no means, a kind of totalitarian prescripting of what will happen. But which points to I think, which is the opposite case to the conditions which obtain in capitalist cyberspace, which I referred to earlier, of lack of security, meaning also lack of unpredictability. The removal of security and the removal of the sense of a managed history, moving in a certain direction, producing instead not a constant sense of surprise, but a perpetual diet of the familiar. So I'm pointing, I guess, in quite an abstract way then to politicising time at both of these levels, recovering a sense of agency, which could also return to us a sense of surprise, which has been lacking in so much of contemporary culture, and particularly popular culture of the 21st century. Okay.